right off the bat, people ask me, we get this question daily is your wheat GMO? Well, GMO wheat's illegal in the United States. I don't think the problem is the wheat itself. I think it's all the things that happen from the time it's planted until it ends up in a loaf of bread at the supermarket that are really the culprits. But for white squishy bread or fluffy squishy bread, it's going to have fats and it's going to have sugars in it. The hard wheats are going to be the ones that we want to use for bread flour, pizza flour, pasta flour, because they have that strength. Soft flours we tend to use, they show up at least in some proportion in all-purpose flour, and they show up in pastry flours for those sorts of things. I still don't like that if you do a long fermented bread from super white flour, okay, you've made the super
Mhm.
white flour more bioavailable such as it is, but you've lost so much of the nutrient density. I think it's better to eat whole grain breads that have been fermented.
Welcome to Dive into Health MD, the podcast where we explore how everyday habits shape your physical, cognitive, and financial well being. Through conversations with physicians, scientists, and farmers, we explore how daily choices like food, movement, sleep, and mindset shape the health and life we experience, with special episodes on sourcing high quality food ingredients. We do our best to stay up to date, and we're always open to refining our thinking as new knowledge emerges. I'm your host, Dr. Akshita Mehta. Let's dive in. If you're interested in trying products from Barton Springs Mill, listeners are welcome to use my code Lifestyle10.
So I could tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. Basically, I am putting together an episode-based series about where our food comes from, food quality, essentially, and trying to point patients in a direction to consume higher quality food, with the ultimate goal being trying to reduce some of the chronic inflammation and chronic disease processes that I kind of see every day in practice. So food, I think, is a big component of health. It's definitely not everything. We need to sleep and move our bodies and all kinds of things, but I think food is a really good place to start to really try and combat some of those things. And there are good people out there giving us options, which I'm so grateful for. But I really want to, I guess, educate our patients about how they can make better choices, because I think it is really challenging to know what to look for.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to help any way I can. And any opportunity I get to sort of clear the air and set the record straight, because there's so much bad information, disinformation out there. People are wanting to do the right thing, but then they've managed to find all of this ridiculous information that's so uh, well, it's just not helpful. I mean, it's right off the bat. People ask me, we get this question daily is your wheat GMO? Well, GMO wheat's illegal in the United States. So where is all of that coming from? So yeah, anything I can do to help with that, I want to be helpful.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I think it's so challenging. And we see people that have eliminated gluten from their diets, a pretty significant population, feeling better. But again, then they can go to other countries, and this is the most common anecdote that I get, and they can eat wheat from somewhere else. And so really differentiating that small volume or small population of patients with celiac, disease and actual gluten sensitivity or intolerance to gluten sensitivity, which is more just probably sensitivity to the way that we have been processing our flour in this country, and how two flour products on the market could probably be very different in chemical composition, right? So that's really what I want to highlight. I really want to drive business honestly to people that are paying attention to these sorts of things. I'm just so grateful that there's people like you out there
Mm,
doing it. But if we could just really start from the basics, I guess, and
sure.
just kind of talk
Yeah.
about what wheat is, how maybe it's changed over the last several decades, and just kind of like you said, get through some of that misinformation that's out there, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, I would say we were talking about, you just mentioned gluten intolerance or gluten sensitivity. I've taken now to calling it perceived gluten intolerance or perceived gluten sensitivity, because I know what a lot of people do is they go through elimination diets and they remove bread and the gluten products. But if you were only removing one item when you did that, it would be much more straightforward, right? So you can eliminate an apple and largely you're 99.5% of what you're removing is the apple. There might be some food polishes on the exterior of the apple or wax, or there might be some residues from pesticides. But for the most part, it's apple. But when you eliminate flour, there's just so many other things in there. If you're not buying single ingredient milled flour, that it makes it really difficult to know for sure if that's really what the culprit is. And so that's why we see so many people that are able to eat bread made from our products with no problem whatsoever. And this is after multiple decades of eliminating gluten from their diet. So
Yeah.
anyway, to start at the beginning, again, some of the disinformation about wheat is that, I mean, wheat has changed in the sense that we now have more sophisticated breeding programs that understand a little more about what's happening when we cross particular varieties of wheat. And then also after the Green Revolution that was brought about by a man by the name of Borlaug, who introduced the dwarfing gene into wheat. Certainly, we see some things now that we saw that we weren't seeing pre 1960s, let's say. So, like I said, the introduction of the dwarfing gene, crossing with lesser known varieties. I still can't point to anything in those parts of the movement that really trigger any sort of inflammatory response from people. Now, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a food scientist, so this is just empirical, but I'm just not seeing those types of that part of the equation being the issue. We do certainly have categories of wheat that we break out. We have ancient grains. So when we talk about that, we're talking about emmer, einkorn, and spelt, and those are varieties that existed on this planet prior to any human intervention. And so many people like to point to those as being a good place to start if you do have a sensitivity, because they are sort of in many people's minds, the purest iteration of these grains. Then we start to see selection, and that is even in the times of the early Ethiopian cultures, farmers going out into the fields and seeing something that is a genetic outlier in a field of wheat and picking that grain and then deciding to perpetuate that grain by planting it and moving it forward. So, for example, emmer, einkorn, and spelt are naturally a hulled item, that it doesn't thresh freely when it's harvested. And so that was an operational hurdle for them to get over in order to make it ready for making into flour. So they did occasionally find a wheat berry of one of these types, that didn't have a hull that was mechanically adhered to the berry. So they would retain that berry and replant it, hoping to perpetuate that particular quality. So we have that, and then we have farmers up into through into the 1930s that were just finding things, selecting them, and then perpetuating that by replanting. They would also intercrop maybe one or two varieties and then select the berries that they liked the outcome, and push those forward. So then after 1930, then we start to see land grant based institutions like the Texas A&Ms, the Oklahoma State Universities, that were then actually trying to apply some sort of scientific method to getting desired outcomes, mostly in the forms of disease resistance, pest resistance, increased yields. Unfortunately, we didn't see as much as we would like to see in terms of milling quality, baking quality, flavor, those sorts of things. They were more worried about volume and getting more grain to market. That really sort of breaks out the different varieties or different classifications of wheat over time. I still say that even modern wheats shouldn't be vilified. I don't think the problem is the wheat itself. I think it's all the things that happen from the time it's planted until it ends up in a loaf of bread at the supermarket that are really the culprits.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's also where, some of this confusion comes from. So wheat over time has been more selective hybridization as opposed to actually intentional modification. And it's been selective to resist things like drought and weather, and other things which could decrease the yield of crop. But I don't think that necessarily translates into a lesser product necessarily. Is that somewhat accurate? I mean, our wheat maybe has changed because people are taking specific berries, replanting those because those crops do well and they can get a higher yield. But is that nutritional composition any different, or is that wheat berry in the end any different than, maybe a strain that doesn't do well in extreme weather or something?
I don't think we really see any substantive differences in the nutritive value of the grains across these different varieties. I think for me, as somebody who got into this specifically because I wanted a better loaf of bread, I wanted a tastier loaf of bread. I'm disappointed that in the decision tree, or the order of priorities, that flavor, baking and milling properties, and even fall far below, in most instances, far below disease resistance, pest resistance,
Gotcha.
priority on yields.
Yeah, so maybe we're seeing wheat that doesn't necessarily contain the wider flavor profile as some of more of those prior varieties. But is that really the main benefit of the Asian grains? Is that the flavor profile is maybe more robust than some of the newer grains on the market, or is there any other benefit there?
There are some people that point to, particularly with einkorn, that the genetic information is much simpler in that grain in particular.
I see.
I really should know more, should be able to retain more information about this, but the strands of DNA are shorter and simpler. And so people equate that to be perhaps because the genetic information is simpler, that it
Mm,
should be easier to digest. I think that's a stretch. I do think they are absolutely more flavorful and they have a lot of character to them. And for me, I want to regard flowers as an equal player in the ingredient list rather than something that's tasteless, odorless, colorless.
mhm.
So for me, that's something to recommend them. But I don't think that the science really bears out that those are any easier on the digestive system or easier on the human body than any other wheat variety.
Yeah, so there is some kind of anecdotal conversations that people who are consuming Asian grains, who just like you said, were gluten intolerant or, stayed away from gluten for several years, they're able to tolerate that better than maybe some of the more modern varieties. But we don't really know if there's, what evidence there really is to that, or if it's really in the post processing of those varieties that then lends to, inflammation.
Right. So
Mhm.
unless you are fortunate enough to have an artisan mill that's just literally putting grain into the mill and then putting it into a bag, there
Mhm.
are so many other things that have to be eliminated. So just to go down the list, if it's grown conventionally, the wheat could be treated, the actual berries could be treated prior to going in the ground. So they could be coated with various things to help against early disease onset, to assist in germination rate and other things. So they're coated with something before it's ever planted. Then you have pesticides, herbicides that can be applied in the field. We don't really, and again, this is a part of the learning a small piece of information and then applying it broadly, the pitfalls of that. We hear a lot about the application of Roundup to wheat in order to expedite browning down so that it's ready to harvest earlier. We don't really see that in the state of Texas because we have dry weather far enough into the season that generally speaking, we're not trying to accelerate. We're not trying to beat the weather in order to get this grain down below 13% humidity or moisture in order to make it safe to harvest. Now, in the Northeast and other parts of the country, that's not true. So if you're buying flour in the store that's commodity flour and you don't know where it was raised, that could possibly be an issue. Here in Texas, Texas wheat, Arizona wheat, even Oklahoma wheat for the most part, you don't see that as an issue. Once it then goes to the storage facility, it goes to the silos, these huge concrete elevators that you see across the Texas panhandle, in order to prevent pest pressure after harvesting. So weevils, pantry moths, granary beetles, they will spray storicide directly on the grain. And again, in this instance, there's never an opportunity for that to be removed. Now, if you're buying roller milled flour, 99% of that outer layer, the bran layer and the aileron layer are removed, but that's after milling. So we know some of that storicide finds its way into the finished product. So once it goes from storage to milling, if it goes to a commercial roller milling facility, then it has to be fortified if it's white flour, because we had this proliferation of pellagra in the 19th century that was killing our children. So flour has to be fortified. Unfortunately, in most instances, this is not very high quality fortification, and it's chemical fortification. Then you have baking enhancers, dough enhancers that enhance the Maillard reaction. That's the browning when the bread is baked, or to increase or improve the rheology. That's the mixing capability when it's being mixed into dough. These are things to make sure that the success of the baking experience is more consistent. And then you take it to a commercial bakery where they're adding preservatives and additional additives in order to get a very consistent outcome. When you go to the supermarket and look at two loaves of bread, they will look exactly the same. So all of those steps, they've been adding chemicals of various kinds, to the extent that I don't see how well, you also have malted barley that's in there in order to enhance the fermentation process. So diastatic malt powder is added. Okay, where did the diastatic malt come from? A lot of times it comes from China. We know that there are issues with other substances creeping into the processing chain when that happens. How do you pluck out which one of those things is really likely responsible for perpetuating an inflammatory response? It's hard to know. It's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is great. This is all of these nuances, all of these things that really end up going into the final product. And this is why two things on the shelf can be completely different, right? But I think these are the things that we really need to be teaching and that we really need to know if we want to identify food products that are not going to cause such a massive inflammatory response for decades on end. You mentioned roller milling. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between stone milling and roller milling?
Sure. So roller milling was invented in about the 1860s. And this is during a time, well, we still, as consumers, have this strange obsession with tying either clarity, the clearness of an item, or whiteness of an item to quality. And this has been an infatuation for centuries, right? So in order to try to make a whiter flour, to make whiter bread, which was considered something, the foodstuffs of the upper classes, roller milling was invented. And that process involves tempering the wheat so moisture is applied to the grain, either in the form of steam or direct water, and then it's allowed to condition for a while. And what this does, this tempering toughens the bran layer on the outside, so that when it goes through the mill, it comes off in bigger pieces, which makes it easier to remove. So after this tempering process, the grain goes through a series of rollers, very high speed rollers that have a helix pattern of blades on them spinning at a very high rate of speed. It essentially explodes the berries, and then they go through a sifting process through screens, which will take off the majority of the bran and remove the germ. After that, it goes through a set of three breaks, they call them, or three sets of these rollers, and goes back through more sifting or bolting. That gets you to essentially a 99.6 to 99.9% endosperm product. So only the white starchy part remains. All of the bran and germ, the places where the nutrient value is most predominant, is completely removed. So that's what happens in roller milling. Stone milling, you have a stationary stone and a rotating stone, a runner stone on top of that. The grain goes down through an eye in the center, and the grain is ground between the two stones. 100% of that finds its way into the bag if you're making whole wheat. We do some sifted product, but because we've ground the flour and we've crushed the germ, we've expressed most of the germ oil into the endosperm. So we still retain a lot of those lipids and the nutritive value of that part of the berry in the endosperm. Also, it's inherently a very inefficient sifting process. So we still, even in our widest sifted flours, have quite a bit of bran. Roller mills can make bran, but the way they do that is after they've made this white starchy product, they will reintroduce a percentage of the bran. Now, they're concerned about long-term storage capability, so they don't reintroduce the germ, because the germ and the germ oil is the portion of the grain that has the capability of going oxidizing over time. Roller milled flour, because it's milled in huge runs and then stored for long periods of time, what you find in the grocery store could be 18 months old. So they absolutely can't retain the germ, and so all of that nutrient density is lost in those flours.
Awesome. Okay, so just to kind of summarize here. So when we grow wheat, the final product is the wheat berry. And there's three main components to that wheat berry. There's the endosperm, which is that starchy component, primarily contributing to white flour. And then there's the bran and the germ. The germ contains those oils, which decrease the shelf life of the product, and part of why that's often removed. So the bran and the germ contain some of those nutritional benefits of the wheat berry. And so when we take those away, we're left with just pure white flour, which really doesn't have a whole lot of nutritional benefit
It's
to the
starch.
consumer. It's just starch. Right. So this is a huge kind of underlying theme as to where we've seen white flour cause health issues in our country. And part of the reason that we've done that was for shelf life, as you mentioned. When we just take the endosperm and make flour out of that, mill that into flour, that can last on the shelf for 12 to 18 months, or, I'm sure some people have had it for longer than that. And we can't really include the germ in that product because of the oils that it contains that can cause that to go rancid over time. So we've really developed this white flour product for shelf life stability and then also for texture, I believe, right? With baking, it kind of lends to this nicer texture that people are used to and that people look for in baking their products. If you have a whole wheat product, some baking products can end up a little bit more dense, I think. So the two main reasons why we're making white flour is for shelf stability and then for texture.
Now, there's one more piece of the puzzle too, which is fermentation, right? So let's say you went to the grocery store and you bought brand A white squishy flour in the plastic bag. That probably went from being mixed to in the bag in an hour to 90 minutes
Okay.
with the use of commercial yeast. So in that time, there's no opportunity for fermentation to take place. If you use sour, and it doesn't even necessarily require the use of sourdough, but you need a long fermentation process because there's something happening in there besides what the yeast organisms are doing. And that is there are alpha and beta amylase enzymes residing in the wheat berry. And they are there in order to convert the endosperm from starch into simple sugars that the germ can consume to send out
Oh.
a rootlet and get above the soil so that it can start finding its own fuel source in order to grow. But to get to that point, it has to access this endosperm. So alpha and beta amylase enzymes break down that starch into simple sugars that are bioavailable to the endosperm. So that's super important step that people overlook. If you don't do the fermentation, then those sugars are not being modified at least prior to the human consuming them. If you
Mm.
do the fermentation, then we've broken those down, and as a result, we find, and studies bear this out, that a bread that has gone through a fermentation period does not spike sugar levels. So again, another part of the puzzle that I think gets overlooked.
Okay. So tell me if this is right. So the endosperm we were talking about is really just starch. And then if we allow for that fermentation process to take place, some of those sugars get broken down and converted. And then so the end consumer is not experiencing just a high level of sugar ingestion, essentially, with fermented products.
Right. We see that we don't see glycemic spikes
Hmm.
when you eat fermented bread. It's certainly better. And that I mean, everybody likes to point to sourdough, and I think there's some good reasons to do that because the colony of organisms that are there, you have the alpha and beta amylase enzymes that are doing their work. But you also have these organisms, mostly that are yeast, but you also have other types of bacteria that are taking these food sources and converting them into something that's far more bioavailable. I still don't like that if you do a long fermented bread from super white flour, okay, you've made the super
Hmm.
white flour more bioavailable such as it is, but you've lost so much of the nutrient density. I think it's better to eat whole grain breads that have been fermented. It's way, way better.
That's such a key product. Prior to starting this whole project, I've tried to, make sourdough starter, especially during COVID when I think a whole bunch of people were doing that. And most of the
Sure.
recipes are all-purpose white flour, right? And there is, a benefit if you are going to be eating all-purpose white flour, then sure, fermenting it will improve the digestive components to it. But starting with whole wheat flour, then it then adds on even more of the nutritional components if we have fermented wheat flour.
I think the writers of these recipes had one thing in mind in the use of either all purpose flour or white bread flour, and that is ensuring success from the
Yeah.
onset, right? Because actually, the reason I got into this business has to do with I was making sourdough loaves from the Tartine book, Chad Robertson, who starts you with simple white flour. And then the minute I made the jump to whole wheat flour, I started making doorstops. So it takes a little more skill in order, it takes a little more skill, a little more patience, a few more powers of observation to learn to adapt to this different product that behaves slightly differently. So, many consider it to be an intermediate to an advanced jump to, uh, and so I think people were preoccupied with making sure that people had early success so that they would stay with the hobby. It's a good place to start. And I'd rather see people eat that than I would, slices of Wonder Bread.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there other things that are being added to that end kind of white flour product that people can look for or should be aware of?
Well, I think mostly in the sandwich loaves, the addition of fat and sugar. And it's a thing that we've been trained to like. I mean, I will tell you, I'm now 8 years into running the mill and eating lots of amazingly delicious artisan made bread. I mean, it just flies through the door. There's more than we can consume. And I have a bakery next door. I mean, the world is my oyster in terms of good quality bread. Does that not mean that occasionally I don't like a slice of white, fluffy, nutritionally void bread? I can't lie to you and say that I don't. I think it's you wax nostalgic for things of your childhood. It resonates in some way. It's comforting in some way. And yeah, it's laden with fat and sugar. So it hits all those receptors. So I get it. Can we come up with something that's a better substitute that still ticks all the boxes? I think so. But for white squishy bread or fluffy squishy bread, it's going to have fats and it's going to have sugars in it.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. I'm so glad that you said that. I mean, the goal of this is not perfection, right, at all, but it's really just making those
Right.
informed choices. And there are absolutely days I eat things and I'm like, this is not the best thing that I could do for my body, but this is delicious and I'm enjoying it. And I'm enjoying it maybe with company and maybe it's a dinner, that I went out to or it's a birthday party and that's okay. That is absolutely okay. But I think if we just could make more educated decisions, then it's totally fine to make that decision. There's days that we decide not to sleep for, 7 to 9 hours a night. And that's okay. No one has to be perfect here. We're all here to live life and enjoy it as much as we can. And that's really the long game. It's really challenging when people, live for several decades with these chronic diseases and they just didn't have the understanding of what they could have done differently. And so the goal is just for the education and then people get to, pick and choose and live the journey that they want. So I love that. That's
Um,
absolutely great. There are some white flour products that I've seen that say some things like no potassium bromate or other things like that added. Is there any utility if someone chooses a white flour product to utilize those kinds of marketing, I guess, ingredients, or is there not really much value there?
think we're seeing more and more now that bromated and bleached flours are relegated to the bottom shelf of the supermarket.
Okay.
I think they still get used quite a bit in large scale commercial baking operations to some extent. But those again make the flour even whiter than they've already managed to make it through the roller milling process. Yeah, I'd like to see people not consuming that, and so I think that's probably the bottom rung. If you're going to the store and you're buying what I call middle shelf flour, I'm going to guess a lot of them probably tout on the bag that they're non-bromated, non-bleached, but it's the same as buying a bag of cornmeal that says gluten free on it. Well, of course it's gluten free. I think those things are there to catch the consumer's eye. Are they really is there any real value add that they're offering there? I think in most instances, not. I really would like to know too what's in the fortification. And that's a bit
Mm,
of an opaque area because what you can buy in terms of low quality food grade ascorbic acid and other things like this in order to reintroduce nutritive value to the flour, I'm highly suspicious of what's going on there. But again, because of the opacity of the industry, it's hard for me to say with any specificity what's going in there. I'd rather eat something that, as I'm sure you preach, less number of ingredients in the ingredient list, the better.
mhm.
So an ingredient list that says wheat, you can't beat that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this may be so silly, but I really didn't think about this until I started again, taking a closer look. But bleached flour, that's just something that I've seen on labels forever. That is actually bleach. Like actually bleaching the flour again, just to get that white color that people are looking for. But that is amazing. We all know how disruptive bleach can be if you consume it and how bad of an idea that is. And it's so incredible that that has even entered our food market. But yeah, so I think just something good for people to think about if you are purchasing a product that says bleach flour. I mean, honestly, before all this, that just kind of seemed like a normal thing. Didn't even, give a second thought as to what that could be, but that is really bleach, a bleach product going into your body, which again, I think just lends itself to cause inflammation and other things that you probably don't want happening. So A good thing to point out. But while we're kind of on the lines of picking and choosing ingredients, like you said, a real challenge with this whole product is the lack of regulations and food labeling regulations in our country. So when it comes to wheat products, there's a pretty significant amount of that as well, where there are things that people are putting on labels like the word natural, which really doesn't mean anything at all, or multigrain or other words. But is there something that people can look for to feel a little bit more confident that what they're purchasing is a whole wheat product if that's what they're looking for?
Gosh, it's tough. And we have a hashtag Know Your Miller
Yeah.
at the mill that we've been using for some time because of the fact that, I mean, so I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues, Jeff Zimmerman at Hayden Mills, his mill is now named after the namesake of the mill that was in Tempe, Arizona. No relation other than the name. But we know from the time that Hayden Mills was making flour, on the bag it said Stone Milled, and Jeff was touring the facility, which still exists in downtown Tempe. And in the very top of the grain elevator where they store the grain, there was a stone mill. And so what they would do is, as they received the grain into the facility, they would turn that mill on, open the stones completely apart so they weren't touching, spin them, and then pass the grain through that mill on its way to the roller mills. Yes.
So the stoves
And
are
then they would
completely apart, not actually grinding it at all.
but they would
Man.
label the flour stone milled.
Oh, there's so much of that in our food society.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that sort of explains it. So I think you have to dig deeper, dig further. I mean, I still think, for consumers worldwide or nationwide, it's hard at the at the broad scale commercial level to
Yeah.
be able to get answers about where did the wheat come from, exactly how was it milled, what else is in the bag besides wheat. And we're still at a point where that's difficult. Now, what I try to encourage people to do is, and in fact, if you order flour from us and you're from out of state, we put a postcard in with every order that goes out that says, we want you to be aware of the other mills within the United States that are doing what we're doing, because we want to encourage you for many other reasons to support your regional grain economy. We want the grain to travel less distance. We want it to have less of a carbon footprint. We want to make sure that we support and sustain farmers in the areas where you live so that they can continue to do this kind of work. So there's a website run by a woman named Amy Halloran, and on her website, you can find a list of all artisan flour mills by state. So
Wow.
I encourage people to do that. And to see where the flour producers are that are close to them and support them.
Is incredible. So another thing that I'm doing is creating kind of these one-page documents where people can go either to their local farmers market or local stores, depending on what ingredient they're looking for, and ask a list of questions. And so, one thing that they could ask is, is this a whole, just really basics, right? Is this a whole wheat product? Is this a white or just an endosperm, white flour product? How is it milled, things like that, to finally see if their end product is something that they want to consume or not. And you've kind of bypassed that. That's amazing. So I'm also creating a national map for different food ingredients. And
Mm.
so someone can then go to that map, and for the exact same thing, I really want us to support all of the local farmers, suppliers, food producers who are paying attention to quality. And if we can funnel money towards them, and if we can create a demand for our population for products like this, then obviously we're empowering those people to then be able to create more or pass along their knowledge to other local farmers in other areas. So that's amazing. I'll totally take a look at that. And then I have some people in different parts of the U.S. that have been asking me for wheat products, and so that'll be really cool to be able to share that. Thank you.
I know there's sort of a sliding scale too with certain food items about where the cost benefit analysis comes out in terms of organic versus conventional. I will say that I think that particularly with grains and grain flours, that there is a definite benefit to making a priority to find organic.
Yeah, and I guess going along those lines, you mentioned earlier that for some wheat products, things like Roundup or glyphosate are being sprayed just prior to harvest. so that the humidity component is a little bit lower. And so, I mean, that's just another kind of, I think, level of nuance and consideration. At one point, some of the pesticide and herbicide products were sprayed when the crop was planted, and then you have a whole season of rainfall and all of these other things that have at least the ability to dilute the amount of chemical in that final food product. But when we're spraying things directly prior to harvest, there's really almost no form for some of that chemical to get diluted or, for it to get washed away at all. We're really spraying, harvesting, and then eating. So yes, the cost benefit analysis with different food products. When is it helpful? When is it not helpful? And it definitely seems like wheat is one of the areas where buying organic is probably significantly helpful.
Uh,
Why is that, by the way? Why is it helpful, or why when we harvest wheat does that humidity level have to be low?
because we want to hedge against the proliferation of pathogen-borne disease or food poisoning, right? So below 13%, any sort of foodborne pathogen that may have ended up on the grain in the field. We have birds flying over, we have
Oh, I
animals
see.
passing through, those sorts of things. Below 13%, or just errant pathogens that may be in the storage facility, because we're talking about immense storage facilities that contain this grain. There are things that they do to clean, but because these are dry facilities, it's all either sweeping, vacuuming, compressed air, those sorts of things. And when we clean grain, we don't use any sort of wet processes for that. It's all dry. So let's say that there's some sort of pathogen that rests on a berry, then it goes to the roller mill, and then it's tempered overnight with the water,
Mm,
right?
just breeding
Then
ground.
those pathogens have the opportunity to proliferate. So that's one of the things we've stayed away from tempering. Tempering could be an option for us, but I don't want the additional risk of foodborne pathogen proliferation during that tempering process. So it's very important that we harvest below. I think that the federal guideline is 15%, but we need a little bit of cushion because as you store grain, that moisture can go up. So we say 13 to 13 and a half. And below that, then we don't have to worry about those sorts of issues. That's why you see warnings on flour now that's roller milled that you shouldn't eat raw cookie dough.
Uh,
That's why.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And that tempering process really is just to alleviate that bran from separating from the endosperm. So if we are using a whole wheat product, is there any utilities for the tempering process?
No, it'd only be if we wanted to make whiter flour.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Cool. So I think we talked a little bit about the white flour, and I really just kind of wanted to go through that because it is a product that so many people are utilizing today. But kind of going towards the whole wheat side, one thing that we mentioned was a storage issue. So white flour was produced in part because it has a much longer shelf life. Can we talk about what the shelf life is of a whole wheat product?
Yeah, something like what we're doing. I tell people 3 months because I don't have a lot of control over what those conditions are. If you store it in an airtight container in the refrigerator or freezer, you can absolutely push that out. Refrigerator probably 6 months, freezing a year. If you have the ability to vacuum seal, probably a year at room temperature. But we occasionally have issues where people say, "Oh, my flour went rancid." I'm like, "Well, tell me more about what happened." "Oh, I had it on a bucket in my garage, and I live in Houston." Okay, I have a hard time controlling some
Yeah.
of those variables. So we say 3 months. And I'd like to see the flour turn over. I think, too, the nutrient density, particularly those lipids, are way better for you soon after milling. So I try to encourage people buy smaller amounts, buy more often, and try to consume the flour. It's just better. And we have more and more people now buying whole berries and milling at home, milling on demand, which those whole berries are like amazing time capsules. If they are not fractured, they're good for years. FDA says 7 years in whole berry form. That's if you can keep the pest pressure out of them. So again, especially when you're growing organic grain, you have to be very careful about it, about the storage conditions. But in terms of the nutrient density and the nutrients within and the freshness of it, whole berries stay fresh for a very long time.
Yeah, that's an amazing option. And also getting into, the way that we tailor medicine in general is really to the patient, right? So you can tailor food and what you're consuming to how you like to eat and what your lifestyle can afford. And if home milling isn't an option for you, then sure, buy smaller quantities, buy more often. If you don't live in an area that, allows for that, then purchasing the whole berries, and those can be consumed as is whole. You can boil them and then add them to
Mm.
salads, and there's a whole other way to consume meat outside of just breads and pastries and cakes and things. And then you can sprout them as well, and that's another really good way to consume these products. So, yeah, I have 2 little toddlers right now, full-time working. I bought a couple of bags of whole berries from you guys, and it's a really easy thing to throw into salads. And that way you get the whole thing and get some of the nutritional value out of that.
Pilaf, to treat it like you would a rice pilaf, is
Mhm.
amazing with vegetable stock or chicken stock, almost like a risotto or a pilaf. They're amazing that way.
Oh, I'll have to try that. That's awesome.
And salads as the primary basis. So the same things you would do with a quinoa salad, for example, like with a vinaigrette and with vegetables, particularly Sonora, I think, which is a much milder berry because it's a wide variety, is amazing in that way too.
Awesome. Awesome. So if we want to get the whole wheat product in order to get all the nutritional benefits and kind of minimize just that starchy ingestion and buy smaller, buy often. If you can't do that, buy the whole berry and then mill at home and just kind of mill as needed. Or you could just buy the whole berry and then use it as is. And that's a good option too.
That sprouting, by the way, also does the same thing. Those alpha and beta amylase enzymes go to work converting those starches. So that's where the real benefit in sprouted grains
Awesome.
lies.
Awesome. And then if someone is interested in milling, doesn't know much about it, hasn't looked into it yet, is there a good place for them to start?
Oh, well, they could come take home milling classes at the mill if if they're close to us. That and probably some of our online resources are a good place to start. I've been directing people to the mock mill as a good home mill for milling flour at home, just because I think the ease of use and also the robustness of the mill and sort of the simplicity of the construction makes it easier for the end user to use. Can the home miller mill as nice a flour as I can make? No, no, they cannot. But I think you can get really close and close enough to make really astounding bread. So I encourage people to do it.
Yeah, I've looked at the mock mill and there's so many different kinds. Is there a certain version that you recommend people starting with?
I think generally the innards in terms of the stones and the adjustment apparatus are the same. And then where the real differences lie is in the quality of the exterior cabinet and the robustness of the motor. So if you think you're going to be doing it once every now and again, I think the base model is probably more than adequate.
Okay.
If you think you're going to become a cottage baker and start baking for your entire neighborhood,
Yeah.
then I would probably go for the one with the more robust motor. Other than that, their innards are really the same.
Okay. And then people have asked me about the KitchenAid attachment. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Other than the fact that it does put a fairly significant load on the KitchenAid motor. So if you think you're going to be a high volume user, I would probably steer away from that one. We all try to preach, we want a tool that has more than one function. So I think it's great when you can do that. I think if you're milling, 2 or 3 pounds a week, then that's probably fine. If you're going to do more than that, I would probably go for one that has an onboard motor.
Something a little bit more robust. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. So we kind of went through the different wheat products, kind of where they came from. We talked about GMO a little bit and how maybe that's not quite as relevant to wheat products. And then some pesticide and chemical concerns. We talked about labeling a little bit and, how really getting as close to the mill and close to the local source as you can is helpful. And then, seasonality. That's another kind of common thread. When people are looking
Mhm.
for certain products, is there any seasonality with certain grains or things that people should be aware of in terms of buying throughout the year?
I don't think so. I mean, we really here in the state of Texas, we have what's called winter wheat. So the wheat is planted around Thanksgiving, and then it'll go until the first frost, and then it goes dormant.
Mhm.
And then in February, after the last frost, it'll come out of dormancy and grow the rest of the way, and be harvested in June. Now other there is also spring wheat, and that is grown in other parts of the United States and the world, but it's not particularly well suited to the hot springs that we have here. So planted in the springtime after the last danger of frost, still harvested in June. So rather
Mhm.
than going through this dormancy period, it goes all in one go from planting to harvest. Our springs get too hot too soon. The grain doesn't have a chance to develop and make the wheat berries before it gets too hot and starts to brown down. Those spring wheats can be much stronger than winter wheats in certain applications. It's again one of those things, it's a piece of knowledge that spring wheat is stronger than winter wheat in terms of dough strength. But I think again, you can't apply that broadly. You have to know more about what you're consuming and what you're buying. That's why we provide all of this laboratory analysis on our website for every grain that we offer, so that people can look at that. Protein levels too. People look at that and say, oh, well, this one is higher in protein, therefore it's going to be a better performer than lower protein. You have to look deeper. I mean, that's a shorthand that may give some indications of performance, but you have to look well past that. So we're now talking really in the bread nerd level stuff here.
I love it.
But you really only have those 2 seasons, and within Texas, you have the 1. And so then grain's gonna be stored long-term and milled, and then maybe stored again for a period of time. So I don't think seasonality, it's gonna be hard for the consumer to trace that if they're buying off-the-shelf supermarket flour. It's gonna be really difficult to do that.
And there are some things that we've been talking about where it's really only worth it. It's really most worth it, I guess, or ideal to eat it within season. But grain, I don't think really falls into that category because those wheat berries can last for a long time. It's not necessarily something that we really should only be eating within 3 months of the June harvest or something. We can store those, ideally as the whole berry for really for throughout the year, and then so we kind of have the option with a wheat product to be able to consume that year round.
It's really one of the things that recommends it in terms of, from the ancient peoples forward, is that it's a foodstuff that can be stored for long periods of time
Yeah.
and consumed during parts of the year when we don't have other food. So, well, historically, we didn't have other food sources, right? So you could eat bread or grain derived products in the winter months when there was nothing else to eat.
Yeah.
So it's one of the great things about it is that in that whole form, it's a splendid time capsule, as it were.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. You were talking about the protein content and some of the kind of nutritional or lab analyses that you're doing. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure, we will always test for certain items on any grain that comes into the facility. First, it's moisture to make sure that it's safe for us to receive. We test for vomitoxin. So vomitoxin is a spore-borne disease that is omnipresent in every wheat field, but only attacks wheat that's under stress for some reason. Drought stress, rain stress, another disease stress. And it lives up to its name in terms of how the human responds if you eat grain that has a high concentration of vomitoxin, but it also leads to other very significant health hazards, stillborn deaths, liver and kidney damage. I mean, it's very serious. So there are mandated limits for these. A person the reality is that can be small amounts of this, but we measure it in parts per million. And so that's the next thing that we have to measure for. And there are mandated levels, not only for human consumption, but for animal consumption. So sometimes these grains can be relegated to animal feed if they have vomitoxin levels that are higher than are approved for human consumption. So that's very serious, and we have to look at that next. Then we look at protein levels and falling number. Protein levels are going to tell us something about the rheology of that bread, that dough that we make. So is it going to be strong enough to make a web that will trap the gases so that we can make these light, lofty, Instagrammable loaves that have big holes? In order to be able to do that, the dough has to be strong. But that protein percentage level is really a shorthand for performance. So we also follow that up with something called a farinograph, which is where some flour is mixed with water. It is put into a machine with a paddle, and then resistance is measured over a period of time. And so they can then express that graphically and show it took so many minutes for the dough to reach maximum resistance against the spinning paddle. And then over time that decays. And so for the professional baker in particular that's working in a mechanized environment, that'll tell them how many minutes they should be mixing the dough in a large mixer, right? Because they're working with large equipment, usually a relatively unskilled workforce compared to, let's say, artisan bakers. And so they need to know, you put the flour and the water in the mixer, you turn it on speed 2 for X number of minutes. So it helps assist them with that information. But it will also tell us too, over time, we are able to look at that information historically and tell what the baking qualities of a flour are going to be based on this farinograph data. So we need that hand in hand with the protein percentage. The other reality is that you have different types of gluten. You have glutenin and gliadinin. These 2 types of gluten are what make this resistance that we're talking about, or make this dough strength. There's also the qualities of those. So for example, Soft wheat
Interesting.
is historically not good for making sourdough breads because the quality of the gluten doesn't have the stuff that it's required to make this web work that traps the gases. So, for example, Sonora, an amazing flour for making flour tortillas and for making pastries and other things like that. It can be 16% protein, but not have the quality of gluten needed in order to trap these gases. I hope that makes sense.
That is
So,
fascinating. Yes, and I
yeah,
definitely have a group of people that I think this level of detail is really, what energizes them and what they're looking to learn from. So that's really cool. So most of that you're able to test for is really for the baking process and to help the chef, but or the baker, but it doesn't really necessarily there's not that much more nutritional analysis in terms of the final nutrition of the product other than the protein differences.
I would say the falling number plays into that, and I hadn't
Okay.
gotten to that. I had dropped that from my conscience. So the falling number tells us what the enzymatic activity in the potential in the grain is. So we talked earlier about this alpha and beta amylase enzymes that convert these starches. If you get a low falling number, that indicates that there was sprout damage in the grain in the field, meaning that the grain browned down and was close to being ready for harvest. You had numerous days of wet weather, and the grain actually started to sprout in the head still on the plant. The problem with that is you've activated those alpha and beta amylase enzymes and they've started to convert the starch. Now, once you harvest it at a dryness level, moisture level of around 13 or less, that process can never be re-kick started once it's been halted. So the quality of that flour will never be of a quality that you can make a good loaf of bread out of, because we can never again start that conversion process. So we're always looking for a number of 350 or higher. And the falling number simply means they mixed flour with water, they put it in a test tube, they have a specially machined piston that they put in that test tube, and then they count the number of seconds that it takes for that piston to fall to the bottom. And that number of seconds is the falling number. So if the grain has started to sprout and then been halted, the flour has no resistance left in it at all. The piston falls almost immediately. So the number will be in the 200 range. But if it's healthy, good wheat, then the number will be in 350 or higher range. That's also important to commodity bakers because those enzyme reactions are responsible for converting those sugars. And if we convert those sugars, then we get a Maillard reaction. Maillard reaction is the browning of the outside of the loaf, the caramely baked smells, aromas, and flavors that we want to have in a finished product. In commodity wheat, if they don't get those from the wheat, then they will add diastatic malt powder in order to kickstart this Maillard reaction. Again, so you've added not necessarily inherently, barley is not a bad thing, but where is the malted barley coming from? How was it treated? There's all the questions that then come along with that addition.
Yeah, fascinating. And you were talking about how two products may have different qualities of the gluten proteins. Where does the quality of protein come from?
Most of that comes from the difference between hard wheat and soft wheat. Hard wheats are going to be the ones that we want to use for bread flour, pizza flour, pasta flour, because they have that strength. Soft flours we tend to use, they show up at least in some proportion in all-purpose flour, and they show up in pastry flours for those sorts of things, because they don't have the strength. And we're specifically looking for that. So we're looking for a particular mouthfeel. If you want fall apart in your mouth sugar cookies or a super tender muffin, we want something that when the baker goes to mix the ingredients, the simple adding of flour and water, immediately you start to form gluten. And that gluten presents itself in a resistance to the tooth. So we want that in pizza. We want that in sourdough bread. We don't want that in a muffin. We don't want necessarily a chewy cookie, or we certainly don't want a chewy, tough muffin. So the soft wheats come into play in these pastry applications.
Okay. Is that something that's typically indicated on the bag if people want to specifically purchase flour for one of those two applications?
Pastry flour would be an indication.
Okay.
All-purpose flour is again an opaque area.
Yeah.
So I tell everybody that we make We don't bring substandard flour into the facility of any sort. So what will happen in many instances at the broader scale is they will simply bring in lower quality hard wheat and use that as at least some part of the formulation for all-purpose flour. So what they're doing is a much more robust set of tests to be able to predict what the performance is going to be. What we choose to do is we take high-quality hard wheat and mix a percentage of high-quality soft wheat with it to get the performance that we want in an all-purpose flour. What commodity mills will do is it is a destination spot for lower quality flour to be used and utilized and purchased. They'll also penalize the farmer for that and pay a much lower rate for that. So they will mix flours in order to get the desired outcome, sort of with a laboratory level of finesse that's beyond our capabilities of sustainability, right? So to go to the store and buy all-purpose flour, you're not going to know what's in it. Pastry flour, it's fairly safe to say that what you're getting is soft wheat. And if you wanted to have your own degree of control over making your own all-purpose flour, you could buy bread flour and pastry flour and mix them to your own proportions. I'm always very transparent. We mix 70% hard to 30% soft to come up with our all-purpose formulations. And again, all-purpose flour, generally speaking, is a compromise, right? They're making that in order to make a flour that has broad application from bread all the way to pancakes and everything in between. We look at it a little bit differently. I think a muffin, for example, a blueberry muffin, is predicated on AP flour, the use of AP flour. You can make a 100% Sonora muffin out of our Sonora, and it is absolutely delicious. You'll be hard pressed to get it out of the muffin tin. It is so tender that there's not enough structure there to hold it together. Now, I want 100% Sonora tortilla. For whatever reason, that formulation and that process of making that holds together just fine. And so it makes for a beautifully tender tortilla that will roll without cracking when you roll it into a taco or roll it into some food delivery system in Mexican food. But if you do that in a muffin, you better put it in a muffin cup because it won't have enough structure to hold together to get it out of the tin. There are some applications where AP is appropriate for the function rather than just being a catch-all.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this hard wheat and the soft wheat, that's more of a function of the quality of the gluten protein, but not necessarily that one is more nutritionally superior than the other. Okay.
Correct.
Awesome. And then there's something, what are red berries?
Okay, so more pigment in the aleuron layer that's just below the outer coating.
Okay.
So you have multiple layers there that constitute the bran layer, and the sort of second layer from the outside is where most of the color resides. As a result, that color equates to what we all know about colorful foods. There's a lot of nutrient and mineral density that's in that layer. So there are white wheat varieties and red wheat varieties. And historically, there is only hard red wheats. We have since bred hard white wheats. There have historically been soft white wheats for forever, but only recently have breeders come up with a way to breed hard white varieties. Why? Because many people are sensitive to the bitterness in bran, and the color, that colored layer, is responsible for that inherent bitterness.
Okay.
It's almost like those who are sensitive to genetically predisposed to a soapy flavor in cilantro, for example.
Yeah.
Some people are really sensitive to the bitterness of whole wheat products. So the breeders found a way to make hard white wheat, and that is less bitter. It's a tannin content that's in that color layer. We now have, and I was not free to talk to you about this when you were at the mill, but we now, as of October 1st, are allowed to talk about it. We have purple wheat that we are now exclusively selling at Barton Springs Mill. We're in a project with Oklahoma State University, and one of our farmers, the breeding program there, Dr. Brett Carver, has developed a hard purple wheat that has We're still waiting for all of the laboratory data to come back because we have to do it raw and also cooked to find out what the nutrient density is after cooking. But 3 to 5 times the anthocyanins in wheat that regular wheat has.
Oh,
And
wow.
it is purple. So we're excited to be bringing that to the marketplace because of the additional nutrient density that will bring. Again, no interest to the roller mills because they
Mhm.
would remove all of that nutrient density.
Yeah.
But to those who are making whole grain flours, it's quite an exciting development. So we will add a whole nother wheat classification, which is a hard purple wheat.
Interesting. Interesting. That's fascinating. And then a whole nother level of either phytochemicals or nutrients in that product. And so another way that people can also diversify, even if you do want to consume whole wheat products, there's still a whole variety of ways to get a different array of nutrients and chemicals, even within just consuming wheat.
They're saying from the at least the raw testing, that the amount of mass or by weight of bread will be comparable to the same weight or mass of blueberries. So that's kind of or blackberries, excuse me. So that's kind of exciting. So it would be a boon for us to be able to present an argument to those that say that grain and flour is inherently unhealthy.
Yeah, that's incredible. You mentioned doing some nutrient density testing after cooking. In general, what kinds of differences do you see in the raw product, which is mostly not consumed, from my understanding, compared to a cooked?
There, we don't see that much, at least previously, because we haven't had. I don't think there have been nutrients in that are, what's the correct terminology? Probably transient, I guess, due to the application of heat over time. But we do know that anthocyanin is susceptible to that. So it's going to take some additional laboratory testing to see if that nutrient benefit is in any way degraded by the.
Yeah. And do we have any idea of if there is a certain almost like max temp that people should be considering where above if you're baking at like 350 versus 425 or something, is there any degradation of the nutrients or do we not really know that or do we not think that that really matters?
I don't think it really matters. I think it's
Yeah.
good to go high enough. I mean, the thing that we millers and pro bakers, pro artisan bakers talk about all the time is the concept of bien cuit, which is, a well formulated crust.
Mm.
And there's a very delicate balance there. A lot of people will look at artisan baker's bread and go, that's burnt. It's not burnt. It's actually thoroughly had the Maillard reaction
Huh.
seen through to its logical conclusion. Now, there's a very fine line between that and burnt. And if a person is tannin, bran and tannin averse,
Mhm.
probably cooking to that level probably accentuates that, and so
Mhm.
that could be problematic. But you're converting sugars when you do that,
Yeah.
and so I always want to see people thoroughly
Ah.
converting those sugars, right, rather
Yeah,
than
yeah.
eating something that's a little more on the raw side.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's actually fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, super cool. So as people maybe start going locally looking for more artisan bakers using these kinds of products, what is the best way to store those loaves? And that's also something that I hear. Someone buys a loaf of sourdough and then in like a couple of days it's rock hard. What's the best way to store that product if they're bringing it home?
I've been, at least with high hydration sourdough loaves that are artisan made. I've had very good luck with the storing in a paper bag on my cutting board with the cut side down towards the cutting board. You can also free sourdough freezes amazingly well. So if you know you can't consume an entire loaf,
Hmm.
cut it in half, wrap one half in saran wrap, and then in foil and freeze it. Then when you want to serve that, and whole loaves are even better. So if you don't have access to an artisan baker or it's far away and you need to get multiple loaves,
Hmm.
wrap those in saran wrap and then freeze them. When you want to serve them, take them out still frozen, run them under a fully running water faucet, just at about this speed. Just run it through and that'll soak the top of the loaf with water.
Okay.
Put it into a 350-degree oven for about 10 to 12 minutes. And what happens is that sudden rush of heat forces that outside moisture to the center and then recrisps the crust. I'm hard pressed to tell the difference between a loaf that's been treated that way and one fresh from the bakery. It's really remarkable
Wow.
how well that works. So freezing is a definite option. if you're just not going through high volumes.
Yeah, and along the lines of freezing, I have a pretty significant population of just really busy, individuals who like to meal prep and kind of batch cook. So can we do that? Would you recommend cooking all the way to the loaf or freezing dough and then baking as needed?
Freezing dough gets to be problematic, especially with sourdough starter cultures, because a lot of those organisms don't, it's not clear how robust they will be when frozen over a period of time.
Mm.
We've done a lot of testing on that because we have a lot of people who make or try to make pizza balls and freeze them.
Yeah.
That will work, but it doesn't work super long term. I think you can get away with a month to 2 months,
Hmm.
especially if you're using commercial yeast and you sort of hyper spike it with really excessive amounts of the organism. Commercial yeast is essentially, we've selected one uber robust yeast organism that survives a lot of adverse um, environments.
Okay.
And so that works pretty well, but still, again, only for a couple of months. After that, too many of the organisms die off. Sourdough's a little more fragile. And depending on where you are, the location, what are the indigenous organisms in your biome and in your kitchen, they can last or not last. So we generally don't freeze sourdough dough.
Okay. So maybe better just to cook the actual loaf and then freeze a loaf and then use as needed. And that'll last maybe a couple months, a little bit longer than the dough.
Longer than that,
Okay.
I would say 6 months, 6 to 8
Oh,
months
wow.
frozen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that
And if
might
you
be a
use this,
real option for some people, right? They can't mill every day or, they just don't have the means to cook a fresh loaf every week, but they can do that, right? Pick a day and make kind of like a whole bunch, freeze the dough and then, store it for a while.
batch baking is really the way to go.
Okay.
We sell 2.5 pound bags of flour specifically so that you can make 2,000 gram loaves, which are sort of the industry standard.
Okay.
And so I would always batch bake 2 loaves of bread. It's just my wife and me. We can't eat that much in a period of time before that goes stale. So I would keep one and freeze one. And
Yeah.
then I'm baking every other week or maybe every 3 weeks, depending on use. But that's a really great way to go.
Awesome. And then when you run that under hot water and then bake at 350, does that then need to be consumed within that meal or will that last a couple of days?
It'll last as if it was a fresh loaf. And just cold water is fine. It doesn't need to be hot.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. You mentioned the type of yeast that there's really kind of one main one that we're using in the industry. Is that something that people should consider or should look at? Is that an okay product to use or is there a better option?
I think it's an okay product to use. My sort of issue with it is more, I'm always obsessed with trying to make the most delicious, the most flavorful, the most interesting, the most complex loaf of bread that I can get. And so anytime you have a greater array or variety of organisms that are consuming these sugars and then making the byproducts,
Yeah.
alcohol, CO2, and then all of these other harder to identify compounds, those lend to the complexity of the finished product. So I like that better. I think that, commercial yeast just with its one particular strain
Mm-hmm.
is just a little monochromatic,
Monotone. Yeah.
as it were. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there where else could people find other strains of yeast? I imagine most people just kind of go to the grocery store, but where else can people look for that?
You can look for them online. You'll find that there are powdered starters. I know that people are infatuated with this is another thing that I think is in the lore category. I have my grandmother's sourdough starter that's 150 years old since she
Wow.
brought it over on the covered wagon, all this sort of stuff. Those things don't really have any weight because a starter will acclimate to its environment.
Okay.
And so the temperature, humidity, but also indigenous yeast that is ever present everywhere we are, the human biome,
Hmm.
people are putting their hands into the dough. Those starters will acclimate to that environment. We have some research facilities that have looked at sourdough, and there are some 350 commonly found organisms that are in sourdough starters, but there are more like 8 or 9 that are sort of common in most of them. And so when you take a starter, let's say from San Francisco, the home of sourdough, and bring it to Texas, within 2 to 3 months, it acclimates to the local environment and the organisms change to suit that environment and what's locally there. You also, if you buy flour from me where the flour has never been heated over 110 degrees, you have indigenous yeast that's resident on the surface of those wheat berries. So you will get some sort of influence from wherever that grain was grown, and you're feeding your starter with that as well. So all of those starters move over time to become a product of the time and place in which they're used.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Okay, and continuing on with, this concept of people sort of making their own. We talked about how it might be beneficial to freeze the flours, and maybe that's kind of what we should be doing in general if it lasts longer and doesn't really seem to degrade the quality. When someone tries to use that product to say bake a loaf of bread, does that flour need to come to room temperature? Does it matter how that's used?
Generally, what I recommend people do is take it out of the freezer, get what you need out, and then put the rest immediately back in the freezer because that thermal mass will want to sweat.
Mm,
And so if it sweats, then you're introducing moisture, right? And we've already talked about the fact we don't want to do that. Generally speaking, in terms of the making of the bread, it comes to room temperature so quickly it's not an issue. I will sometimes adjust my if I'm going to use frozen or flour that was in the freezer, it doesn't really freeze, but flour from the freezer, I might adjust my water temperature by a degree or two in order to make sure that the fermentation process goes at the speed that I want so that it suits me. This is one of the things about being a newbie sourdough baker is you bake to the demands of the bread in the early going until you become skilled enough to conform it to your will.
yeah.
And so the ways you do that are with time and temperature. So you'll adjust your water, you'll ferment in the refrigerator or out of the refrigerator in order to tailor the baking experience, fermentation experience to your own schedule rather than being slavish to it. So if I take flour out of the freezer, I will maybe adjust my water temperature a little bit to compensate for that.
Okay. Awesome. But can be used right away. That's super helpful.
Mhm.
And then kind of along the lines with cooking, talking about the wheat berries, is that a product that should be washed kind of like rice prior to boiling or consumption?
I've never done that.
Okay.
I've never done that. A lot of times you're removing dust and impurities. I'm pretty proud of the cleaning process we do at the mill. We're using, you've been to the mill and you've seen our seed cleaner. It's
Yeah.
ancient technology, but it's still the prevailing and best technology. So we don't have a lot of foreign items. A lot of times you'll wash beans to see if there's any that float or any impurities that float. It helps you to locate those items
Yeah.
and to remove them. Any foreign material. I don't really see a need to do that. And then, of course, if you're going to be cooking them in boiling water,
Hmm.
then you're fine. I also like pressure cooking of wheat berries is a much
Oh,
faster way.
yeah.
So
Yeah. That's what I did a couple days ago. A
mm,
little bit strapped for time, and the pressure cooking makes that go by way faster. It was super
yeah,
nice.
vegetable stock and wheat berries in the pressure cooker is a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Awesome, awesome. Okay, and then kind of going back to people talking to different mills, trying to find something local that they may want to buy from. A lot are suppliers such as yourselves that may or may not be directly farming, themselves, the wheat products. What are some things that they can either ask to get an understanding of if their supplier, I guess, is obtaining products that they think they are? So maybe for lack of better words, if you're not the one farming, right, but then you're supplying the wheat products, how do you know what exactly is happening on those fields, and how can you be sure that there are organic practices or things like that?
I think first you ask, is it certified organic?
Okay.
And then ask, where did the wheat come from? Do you know the variety? I mean, this is getting into high level stuff here. I always want to know the variety. As I said, I don't think there's anything inherently evil in the variety,
Hmm.
but it tells you something about the knowledge of the people that are presenting this to you. They should know.
Okay.
If they tell you hard red winter wheat and that's all they know, it's not necessarily a end of discussion type answer,
Yeah.
but it's somewhat indicative. And I would always want to encourage that vendor to know more
Yeah.
about that, right?
Yeah.
Know the farmer, know where it was grown, know if it was organic or not, know the variety. And also when you're buying baked products, this is an unfortunate reality. It is in the industry acceptable to name a flour mill and or variety of flour in a baked product if that product has 15% of that flour or more.
And we see that in so many things. We see that with honey. We see that with olive oil. We see that in almost everything. You can call something pure raw honey and it can be 30% of a honey product and the remainder can be corn syrup. Well, and then on top of that, there's no one even regulating that, right? So, I mean, the rules can say 30 and it could be 5 and who knows? Who knows what's really going into that bottle? And one of the main themes here is just getting as close to the source as you can. So you can ask as many questions as you can because yeah, these labeling terms, I mean, it's so easy to be taken for granted.
There's an industry term for it. It's called fairy dusting, sprinkling a little fairy dust on the
Sprinkle
top.
some Barton Mill, Barton Springs in a mill flour on there, and that's where the loaf cake
And
from.
it's a existential crisis for me as a miller. I mean, I know
Yeah.
I have huge wholesale accounts that I know that buy, I mean, tons and tons of flour from me, but it doesn't constitute the majority of what goes in. Now, there can be arguments made that they are baking bread to a particular palate, to a particular desire for a particular texture. And so they're using the flour in order to bring flavor
Mhm.
to a texture that is familiar to people from childhood. And so it's hard to argue with that. And if that's what the consumer wants, the consumer is driving that. And I
Mhm.
think that's one of the many reasons that we have the education center at the mill is to inform consumers and to show them what the possibilities are
Yeah.
and then get them to ask for the things that they want in the marketplace. I think all of those things, I think flour in the farm to table scenario is sort of bringing up the rear of that movement. And because our industry is so opaque, it's been hard for the consumer to learn what's out there, what to ask for, what to look for.
Yeah.
So thank you for helping with that.
No, thank you too. And I think that really is just a big underlying issue when we look at food for health and why people haven't had a lot of good answers. We have incredible research out there. We have research showing that there's health benefits of olive oil. And I think so many people have heard this story and have maybe even seen those studies, but why are we not seeing that in the American population? Tons of people consume the product, and I think it's because when you do studies in a Mediterranean population where, someone's consuming olive oil 2 weeks after harvest and it's close to, 1,000-year-old orchard, that product is chemically different from something in an American grocery store shelf. There's a discrepancy in the health effects there. So there is good information out there. There are good studies out there, but I think we're falling short when it comes to the quality of those products. And two, bread products are not chemically equivalent and nutritionally equivalent. And that is true for any ingredient on the market. So that's really kind of the incentive here is to just push people to say, hey, I think you can almost eat anything. Or maybe some people are sensitive to some things and they're not. But whatever your body, feels good eating, just try and find a higher quality product. And I think we can combat a lot of disease this way.
One last thing that sometimes comes up in this is the value proposition of buying these flowers and eating products made from these flowers. A thing that the consumer needs to understand is that they should be prepared to pay significantly more for these food items
Hmm.
than they pay for commodity flour. And there's a lot baked into that. So we have historically in the United States subsidized grain production for so many years that the price of commodity wheat and commodity flour is artificially low. I like to tell people all the time that they can go to the store and buy a pound of flour for way less than I even pay the farmer at the farm gate for a pound of berries.
Yeah.
The French have the same problem. If the cost of a baguette goes up by 5 cents, they riot in the streets because they see it as something indicative of the breakdown of their government. I mean, that's how emotionally tied they are to the price of the cost of a baguette. Again, not rooted really in reality. So be prepared, you know, adjust your mindset that these things will cost more because we're ensuring the future of farming, we're ensuring the success of the farmers that grow in this manner organically that produces less per acre. And then we're ensuring that what people are eating is indeed healthy.
Mhm.
It comes at a cost. So adjust your mind to that and be open to it.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you brought that up, and that is a major thread. One of the 3 main things that I'm talking about as well is the finance piece of this, right? And to understand first how much it costs to do something the way that, you're doing things. The quality, the paying attention to the quality of an end product is challenging. And there's so many steps along the way, almost despite what you're eating, where that can fall through. And so, but what's, I think kind of was at least the turning point for me was really looking at this nutritional analysis that we're able to do with so many food products now. You are able to show that the wheat that you're getting is nutritionally distinct from something that might be on a grocery store shelf. And I think when people can finally see that, and we're doing this with fish, we're doing this with chicken products, depending on how those animals were raised. We're doing this with produce, depending on the nutrient density of the soil. When you can see that end product, I'm hoping that people will get a deeper understanding of how much more effort it takes to get there. And that's what you're paying for. When you want first press, cold press olive oil, right? The amount of regulation of the temperature from olives to oil is incredible that someone's even willing to go through that process to make high quality olive oil. For wheat, the same thing all the way through, right? Running a snow mill is more expensive than running a roller mill. And you're laughing because there is so much more to that, right? When we talk about just owning the mill, the insurance, the farmers, the relation, the transportation, controlling the temperature during that transportation process, the storage, controlling the storage during that transportation process, the warehouses, the shipping. Where if we're paying attention to shipping, there are companies that have put so much of their money just into the shipping of the product, because if you want to go through this whole process of raising a high quality product, growing a high quality product, and you ship it and you don't pay attention to that, then what that consumer may get could be a totally degraded product, even though it started out really well. So at any step of the way, the nutritional value can be lost. And that starts with the growing, that goes through the harvesting, through the processing, through storage. That's why I, ask so many questions about, well, how do we store this thing? If we have a really high quality whole wheat flour, but it's been on our shelf for 2 years, it's probably not, giving you what you think it is or what you want to get out of it. And then ultimately what ends up on our plate has a whole story behind it. There's a whole journey behind where that came from, and it costs a lot of money to have that final product on your plate be valuable. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing it up. Thank you for this. This was awesome and super fascinating, and I think people are going to love it.
I'm glad to have the time with you today, and thanks for making the visit to the mill, and thanks for your support.
Yeah.
If I can do anything else to help you, please ask.
I will. I will. We'll definitely stay in touch.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Dive into Health MD. Our goal is to empower you with knowledge to better understand how your daily choices influence your health. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it and subscribing so you don't miss what's next. Please remember, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For personalized guidance, always consult your physician or a qualified healthcare professional. Wishing you physical, cognitive, and financial wealth. See you in the next episode.